Information structure and prosody in the Russian of bilinguals and second language learners. And without further ado, let's give her another welcoming applause.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much for inviting me. This was my third attempt to come to Tromsø and the first time that I finally made it. So very happy to be here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a series of studies that my colleagues and students and I have done on word order in Russian. The overall objectives of this research program are to examine what learners of Russian as a second or heritage language know about the relationship between word order, information structure, and prosody, to examine whether there is transfer from the first or dominant language in this domain, and to examine whether heritage speakers have a selective advantage over second language learners in this domain and what the nature of the advantage is. So to say a few background words about the populations that we're working with, heritage Russian speakers are speakers who grew up in, given the particular populations we are studying, they grew up in either the US or in Israel, with therefore English or Hebrew as their dominant language, and Russian as their home or heritage language and not the one that they use at school or in the society as a whole. It's well known that there is much variability in the heritage speaker population in terms of how much input they receive, whether they receive any schooling, have any literacy in the language, and so forth. My colleague Styrina Montrul, among others, has done a lot of work with heritage language speakers. We know that heritage speakers may be subject to incomplete acquisition, that is not acquiring all the aspects of their native language, heritage language fully, as well as to attrition, which we just heard about in the previous talk. One of the goals of our study is to compare heritage speakers and second language learners of Russian in the US context. So unlike heritage speakers, L2 learners of Russian in the US context, at least, are typically exposed to Russian well after puberty, most commonly in a college classroom, since it's not a language that's commonly taught at the high school level. In contrast, heritage speakers grow up exposed to Russian at home, may or may not receive any formal instruction in Russian, may in fact end up taking Russian courses once they get to university. There are very few comparisons between second language learners and heritage speakers of Russian, as opposed to such comparisons that exist for other languages, most notably Spanish. Why is it interesting to make these kinds of comparisons? Well, they can inform our theories in many different ways. One is to look at the relative role of age. If successful acquisition of a language were guaranteed, as long as one was exposed to it early, we'd of course expect heritage speakers to pattern with monolingual speakers of the language, but we know that doesn't happen. So clearly age of acquisition is not the only relevant factor. One reason why heritage speakers are likely to differ from monolingual baseline speakers is that they differ in the amount, quantity or quality of input and opportunity to use the language. So we can examine whether the role of having reduced input, reduced use in the language affects heritage speakers and second language learners equally. We can also examine whether transfer can work in different directions, where cross-linguistic transfer affects heritage speakers coming from, in terms of transfer from the dominant language versus second language learners in terms of transfer from the first language. And we can also examine whether there are selective advantages. For example, it's generally found that heritage speakers tend to have an advantage over second language learners when it comes to phonology, but not necessarily when it comes to morphosyntax. Another part of our program is to examine heritage languages under different dominant languages. There are relatively few studies that look at a single heritage language with different dominant languages. There are some studies actually of heritage English by Maria Goldshtein and colleagues who look at heritage English under the influence of different dominant languages. And as discussed in Polinsky's book, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of evidence from transfer from the dominant language. There have been studies of heritage Spanish under the influence of quite a variety of different dominant languages, but these studies were not specifically designed to tease out the influence of the dominant language. Different studies have used different dominant languages as well as have looked at different phenomena. So the question of how, to what extent cross-linguistic influence affects heritage language acquisition, that is the extent to which heritage language speakers of a given heritage language, such as Russian, might differ depending on their dominant language, is still fairly open. So one of our goals is to compare Russian heritage speakers who grew up under the influence of English versus Hebrew in order to examine whether they behave differently due to different properties of their dominant language. There have been much prior research on the syntax and semantics of heritage Russian in terms of work with adult heritage speakers of Russian in the US. By Maria Polinsky and by many others. A number of difficulties are documented for these populations, including incomplete acquisition of case and gender morphology, difficulty with complex syntactic structures, and restructuring of grammatical aspect. There's been quite a bit of research on children who are growing up bilingual in Russian and another language, some of it in fact done here. But they have looked at different dominant languages and have also found difficulty with, in particular, complex morphology, grammatical gender, and case, for example. Our focus is somewhat different in that rather than looking at morphosyntax, we are looking at the syntax-discourse interface, which is often found to be particularly vulnerable to bilinguals. In particular, under Sriracha's interface hypothesis in its more recent instantiations, the external syntax-discourse interface is supposed to be particularly subject to vulnerability and to attrition effects in different types of bilingual populations. So to go more specifically into what we are going to be, what we address in a study, we look at two different aspects of information structure in Russian. In our first set of studies, we look at the relationship between Russian word order, canonical versus non-canonical, and information structure, specifically old versus new information. Within this larger study, we on the one hand compare English dominant heritage speakers and second language learners of Russian, and on the other hand, English dominant versus Hebrew dominant heritage speakers of Russian. In our second series of study, we examine the expressive of contrastive focus via prosodic prominence in Russian. Again, comparing English dominant heritage speakers and second language learners of Russian. And we also have a follow-up specifically with second language learners, examining their relative sensitivity to discourse prominence versus prosodic prominence. Across these studies, these are the main research questions that we address. Do heritage speakers of Russian have a selective advantage over second language learners of Russian when it comes to syntax-discourse interface phenomena? Is there transfer from the dominant language for heritage speakers and or second language learners in this domain? And do both heritage speakers and second language learners improve on these phenomena with proficiency? These are my collaborators. Maria Goldshtein and Tatiana Luchkina are both alumni of our department. Maria is now a postdoc at Arizona State University, and Tatiana is faculty at Stony Brook University. And Sofya Styrina is a current graduate student in our program. So here first I'll talk about our first set of studies, that is the relationship between word order and old versus new information. So I know we have a lot of Russian speakers here, but for those who don't know Russian, just some brief background on Russian word order. Russian is a fairly free word order language, but nevertheless, the canonical word order SVO is by far the most frequent, estimated at 79% of all three-member sentences in written Russian. When it comes to non-canonical word orders, OVS is much more frequent than the others, estimated at 11% in written Russian, found to be generally more common in written than in colloquial Russian. While these corpus studies that I'm citing here are all fairly old, they have been confirmed by more recent experimental evidence, as I'll mention later. For most nouns in Russian, case marking unambiguously indicates nominative versus accusative case. There are nouns for which case marking is ambiguous, but we only included the unambiguous kind in our study. With regard to Russian, the relationship between Russian word order and information structure, we're focusing only on what has been termed non-emotive or neutral sentences for this first part of the study. That's non-emotive sentences are defined as sentences in which sentence stress falls on the rightmost constituent. No element is in contrastive focus. Under such condition, SVO order is particularly appropriate if the object is a narrow focus, if we are asking an object question, while OVS word order is most appropriate if the subject is a narrow focus, if we're asking a subject question. Of course, SVO would also be the preferred order in wide focus sentences where we're simply answering a what happened kind of question, but we're leaving those aside in our study. We are focusing on situations where out of the object and the subject, one is old information, the other is new information. Within that configuration and under the conditions of sentence stress on the rightmost constituent, it's most felicitous in Russian to put old information first and new information last. And these preferences were confirmed by experimental findings in a dissertation by Luchkina 2007 with adult native monolingual Russian speakers who did in fact strongly prefer SVO for object questions and OVS for subject questions. To take some concrete examples, if we ask an object question, "Кого укусила собака?" who did the dog bite? And we answer it with a full sentence, the most felicitous answer would be "Собака укусила кошку," the dog bit the cat or a cat. While if we ask a subject question, "Кто укусил собаку?" who bit the dog? Again, if we're keeping the prosody neutral, the most felicitous order would be "Собаку укусила кошка." That is, the dog got bitten by the cat. Obvious. What do we know about word order in development? There have been a number of studies that have looked at Russian word order with bilingual as well as with monolingual children. For example, a recent study by Johnson and Mayer compared Russian Hebrew and Russian Dutch bilingual children on their comprehension of Russian word order. Dutch mostly disallows OVS order. Hebrew allows it with definite objects, which is something I'll talk about in a little more detail later on. What they found was that both groups of children would often misinterpret OVS order in Russian as SVO, largely ignoring the case marker cues, unlike monolingual Russian-speaking children of the same age. And in elicited production, both groups of bilingual children tended to misuse nominative case in place of accused. Something similar has been found with adult learners of Russian. For example, adult heritage speakers of Russian with English as the dominant language have also been found to over-rely on SVO order in production. A study by Cho and Slabakova compared English-speaking and Korean-speaking second language learners of Russian. And they actually tested something similar to what we are testing, which is whether these populations recognize that OVS is preferred when the object was old information, as opposed to when it was new information. They found that both groups of second language learners they tested did make this distinction, but the distinctions numerically were very small, didn't always reach statistical significance. Because this was a written task, they were not able to control for the prosody of the sentences, and there was also no SVO condition tested. And finally, there was an intervention study by Van Patten et al. With adult L1 English L2 Russian learners, who also found that learners initially over-relied on canonical word order, misinterpreting OVS as SVO, although they did improve with instruction. So with regard to our study, the relationship between word order and information structure is not something that's taught in the classroom. And there are several reasons to expect heritage speakers to have an advantage over second language learners in this domain. After all, non-canonical word order is acquired quite early in childhood. Very young children already recognize differences between SVO and OVS order. And the relationship between word order and information structure is related to prosody, since heritage speakers are more likely to receive oral input in Russian than second language learners because they are receiving oral input from their families. They may therefore have an advantage. This said, however, corpus data suggests that Russian is overwhelmingly an SVO language, that OVS order is actually relatively infrequent and apparently even less frequent in spoken Russian relative to written Russian. So that means that maybe heritage speakers don't get an advantage. Even if they get more exposure to oral input in Russian than L2 learners do, there may not be enough OVS in there for them to really recognize what the function of OVS is. Because for us, really, the question isn't just can they tell OVS apart from SVO, but do they recognize what SVOs, when to use each one with regard to information structure. So that's one of the topics we're addressing. The other one is, again, the influence of different dominant languages, English versus Hebrew. English, of course, is a rigid word order language with no case marking except for pronouns, and OVS order simply does not exist. Hebrew order is more flexible than that of English, but less flexible than that of Russian. OVS word order is possible in Hebrew, but considerably more constrained than in Russian, and constrained only to sentences with definite object. Hebrew doesn't have a rich case marking system like Russian, but it does have an accusative case marking particle at, which is obligatory with definite objects and unacceptable with indefinite objects. Although in a very recent paper, Kagan and Hakohen actually showed experimentally that that is possible with partitive indefinite. So they argued that it's not really a definiteness marker, but a differential object. Modern Hebrew has SVO order, but when the definite object is marked with the accusative particle at, OVS as well as OSV order is allowed. Here's an example from Johnson and Mayer. The girl sees this boy can be produced with OVS at the boy, this sees the girl. Informants confirm that in Hebrew, as in Russian, it is possible to use OVS order to answer a subject question. So who sees the boy? You can say the boy sees the girl, where the boy is marked accusative. Although it seems that OVS is not the preferred answer to this context. In this context, canonical SVO seems to be preferred. Some speakers prefer to use OVS only when the object is contrastively focused. Unfortunately, we're not aware of any corpus data on the frequency of OVS order in Hebrew as opposed to Russian. But still, we know that at least OVS order is possible in Hebrew, where it's not at all possible in English. So in terms of what predictions can we make for word order and information structure in the Russian of bilingual speakers? If there is transfer from the dominant language in this domain, Hebrew dominant heritage speakers may have an advantage over English dominant speakers, since Hebrew does allow OVS order. If early age of acquisition confers an advantage in this domain, English dominant heritage speakers should have an advantage over English dominant second language learners of Russian. So turning to our methodology, in our experimental study, we tested 43 baseline monolingual speakers of Russian, 34 L1 English L2 Russian learners in the US, 23 English dominant heritage speakers of Russian in the US, and 18 Hebrew dominant heritage speakers of Russian in Israel. And the main test instrument was a bimodal acceptability judgment task. We also had proficiency tests. Everything was put online using Qualtrics, and the majority of participants responded remotely, although some second language learners were tested in a lab setting. In terms of proficiency comparisons, we actually used two ways of estimating proficiency in this population. On the one hand, we used a multiple choice cloze task developed by my colleague Tatiana Luchkina and co-authors. And we also had a brief case check task to check whether participants could tell which noun in the sentence was nominative and which was accusative. Our three groups of bilinguals did significantly differ on both of these measures. The second language learners of Russian had on average the lowest proficiency scores. The English dominant heritage speakers patterned in between, and the Hebrew dominant heritage speakers were the most proficient. So for that reason, we took proficiency into account in our statistical analysis to see how it affected these different populations. So in our first subset of the study, we compared English dominant heritage speakers and second language learners of Russian. Here's a table with their demographics. They had relatively similar age range, but of course they had very different demographics in terms of when they were exposed to the different languages. The heritage speakers were all exposed to Russian at birth and to English by age 8 at the latest. Some were born in the US, others came over from Russia as young children, while the second language learners were all exposed to English from birth or soon after, but on the other hand, were not exposed to Russian until after puberty, with the exception of one who had some brief exposure to Russian at age 9. If we compare the same group of English dominant heritage speakers to Hebrew dominant heritage speakers, they had very similar profiles. Again, some were born in Russia, others moved to Israel or to the US as children, and had a variety of ages of US or Israel arrival. Turning to our main test instruments, a bimodal AJT. Each item consisted of a question followed by an answer, and it was presented, the dialogue was presented in both written and auditory form. Of course, the auditory presentation was important in order to control for prosody. Additionally, it's been found in the past that heritage speakers tend to do better on oral tasks and second language learners on written tasks. We wanted to be sure that our participants had access to both modalities. The participants' job was to rate the appropriateness of the answer given the question on a 1 to 5 scale. For the purposes of this first study, I'm going to focus on 48 items which tested the relationship between word order and information structure. The study also included 24 items on contrastive focus, which I'll talk about later, as well as fillers on various other phenomena. So the relevant items were created using a 2x2 design, which crossed question type, object question versus subject question, with what order of the answer, SVO, OVS. And the answer was always pronounced with stress on the rightmost constituent with neutral prosody. Given this, under these conditions, the felicitous combinations were an object question with an SVO answer and a subject question with an OVS answer, while the other two categories resulted in infelicitous dialogues. So we ended up with 48 target items, 12 per condition distributed across 4 lists using a Latin square design. Here is a sample token set. We used for half of our items, we used names of animals. For the other half, we used proper names. So here's an example of an animal token set. An example of an object question would be "Кого вчера увидел орел?" Who did the eagle see? In this case, this can be felicitously answered with SVO. Орел увидел лису. The eagle saw the fox. But it's very infelicitous to use OVS. Лису увидел орел. On the other hand, if we ask a subject question, кто вчера увидел лису, who saw the fox? Under neutral prosody, the best answer is лису увидел орел. The fox accusative saw the eagle nominative, while doing SVO under neutral prosody is not so good. So here, for this, now we have those 4 test categories, and now I'll show the results. Here is the results for our L2 heritage comparisons. So we have on the left, I guess you cannot see the mouse moving up there. So on the left, we have the, actually, can I? Does this have a pointer in it, I wonder? No, it's not. Anyway, so on the left, we have the baseline speakers. So for object questions, as you can see, they're rating SVO much, much higher than OVS, about a 5 for SVO and something like a 2. A little over a 2 for OVS, while with subject questions, it's OVS that's getting rated very high, close to like 4.5, and SVO, which is getting low. So the baseline monolinguals are giving us the distinction that we expected, which is a strong preference for SVO in answer to an object question and for OVS in answer to a subject question. The difference is bigger for object questions than for subject questions. This is not surprising because it's always possible to use SVO even for subject questions. It just, the prosody isn't quite right. But crucially, they made a statistically significant distinction in both directions. Heritage Russian speakers pattern very much like the baseline monolinguals. Although the differences are numerically a bit smaller, they also strongly preferred SVO for object questions and OVS for subject questions, and these were statistically significant differences. Second language learners, on the other hand, showed a completely different pattern. They made much smaller distinctions between conditions, and they actually significantly preferred SVO to OVS for both types of questions. So it looks like they completely disregarded question type and just relied on SVO as the most felicitous one. Now, of course, this is just the results at the group level, but as I mentioned earlier, our second language learners were less proficient than our heritage speakers. So we wonder to what extent these patterns is really about a difference between heritage speakers and second language learners, and to what extent it's about proficiency. So we ran a second comparison excluding the baseline speakers and just focusing on the second language and the heritage speakers and including proficiency as a variable in our analysis. And here is a plot of the results that we got. The main thing to find is that for heritage speakers, the 2 felicitous conditions, that is object questions with the OVS answers and, object questions with the SVO answers and subject questions with the OVS answers, the lines go up with proficiency. The lines have a positive slope, while for the 2 infelicitous conditions, the lines go down with proficiency. So for heritage speakers, as they become more proficient, they make ever stronger distinctions in the target direction. They prefer SVO for object questions and OVS for subject questions and disprefer the others. For second language learners, though, the improvement with proficiency only affects 3 out of 4 conditions. They do get a little better at rejecting the infelicitous combinations, and they do get better also at accepting SVO answers to object questions. But when it comes to OVS for subject questions, the line stays flat. There is no improvement with proficiency, which indicates that proficiency doesn't wholly account for the difference between heritage speakers and second language learners. Second language learners, even at the highest proficiency levels, do not recognize that OVS is a felicitous response to a subject question in Russian. They still continue to prefer SVO. So to summarize what we found, we did find that heritage speakers have an advantage over second language learners in this particular domain. Heritage speakers exhibited very similar preferences to the baseline monolingual controls, preferring OVS for subject questions and SVO for object questions, while the L2ers had a preference for SVO regardless of context. Where does this SVO preference come from? Well, it's consistent both with transfer from English, of course, where SVO is the only possible order, and it's also consistent with the very high frequency of SVO in Russian, SVO being the canonical. So they simply don't recognize that there is another option. And crucially, while the heritage speakers as a group were more proficient than the second language learners, proficiency alone cannot account for the results. Second language learners did not improve with proficiency on OVS for subject questions, unlike heritage speakers. Moving to the results for the second comparison, the two heritage speaker populations. So the graph looks a little different. So in this case, we are comparing, again, three different groups. So we have the orange bars are the English dominant heritage speakers, the green bars are the Hebrew dominant heritage speakers, and the blue bars are the monolingual controls again. As you can see, the three groups look extremely similar across all four conditions. All three groups give the highest ratings to SVO for object questions and OVS for subject questions. The Hebrew dominant speakers did pair in a little bit more closely to the baseline monolinguals than the English dominant speakers, but because the Hebrew dominant speakers were also the ones with high proficiency, we again included a proficiency comparison, and it found that whatever differences there were between the two groups of heritage speakers, they were fully accounted for by proficiency. Once we included proficiency in the model, the dominant language made no difference, and both groups showed the same kind of improvement with proficiency, getting better on the felicitous and worse in the infelicitous category. So to summarize, both heritage speaker groups show the same pattern as monolinguals, preferring SVO for object questions and OVS for subject questions. And any advantage of the Hebrew dominant group was fully accounted for by their also having higher proficiency. While proficiency was included in the model, we found no group difference. So we did not find any advantage conferred by Hebrew as the dominant language over English as the dominant language. Why was that the case? Why was there no advantage for Hebrew? We might have expected that Hebrew dominant speakers might have done really well even at low proficiency level if they could, after all, transfer the mapping between word order and information structure from Hebrew, but we did not find this. Well, one possibility is that discourse-based properties like the mapping between word order and information structure are simply not subject to transfer. The other possibility is that maybe we didn't have the right dominant language because, as I said before, OVS is considerably more constrained in Hebrew than in Russian and doesn't behave quite the same. So it would be quite interesting to rerun this study with a dominant language which patterns more closely to Russian. So Finnish would be an example, still a typologically very different language, but closer to Russian in terms of OVS being quite common and case marking being very productive. So that remains to be seen. All right, now I'll switch gears and move to the second half of our study, which is an examination of contrastive focus and prosodic prominence in Russian. So much of that work hasn't been published. Only a small subset of that work has been published. This is something that we're still very much working on. So to say a few words about contrastive focus in Russian first, it's generally agreed upon in the literature that there are two different types of focus. What I've been talking about so far in our first study was informational focus. An element which is an information focus provides new information, for example, in answer to a WH question. What did the cat eat? The cat ate some lettuce. On the other hand, an element in contrastive focus contrasts with previously stated information. Did the cat eat some fish? No, the cat ate some flowers. These examples refer to my cat who likes both lettuce and flowers, among his favorite things to eat, if you're wondering. When it comes to expression of contrastive focus, in some languages, most notably Hungarian, contrastive focus is associated with a particular syntactic position. But in many others, including English and Russian, contrastive focus is prosodically marked and can occur just about anywhere in the sentence. In the case of Russian, contrastive focus is encoded intonationally rather than in the syntax, although there is maybe some preference for the immediately pre-verbal position to be the place for contrastively focused objects or adjuncts, but contrastive focus can also appear elsewhere in the sentence. Comparing English versus Russian, in the case of both languages, it has been argued that the intonational contour that marks contrastive focus is different from the one that marks information focus, which is not to say that English and Russian have the same prosodic contour. They may be subtly different, but they crucially both use prosodic means to signal contrastive focus specifically. But of course, the difference between English and Russian is that Russian also has much freer word order, so that contrastively focused element can be just about anywhere in the sentence. So for example, if I ask, is the cat eating fish? And I disagree with that, and I want to say, no, the cat is eating flowers. And there's my cat eating flowers in that picture. I can say that with a variety of word orders, including quote, yes, цветы, the cat is eating flowers, as well as quote, цветы есть, quote, the cat is flowers. There have been a few prior studies on focus expression in second and heritage languages other than Russian. Been quite a few studies that have looked at focus on L2 Spanish as well as in heritage Spanish. And the findings are somewhat mixed. Some studies tend to find that both second language learners and heritage speakers can be quite target-like in their expression of focus, while others do find difficulties. Most of these studies have actually looked at informational rather than contrastive focus. One exception is WHO 2009, who looked at contrastive focus in heritage Hungarian and found a lot of similarity in how heritage Hungarian speakers versus Hungarian dominant speakers interpret contrastive focus. To the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been prior work on the expression of contrastive focus in Russian specifically. What might be the role of transfer in this domain? Well, for our purposes, English and Russian are very similar in that both mark contrastive focus using prosodic means, not using syntactic means, and allowing contrastive focus at different places in the sentence. So in this particular case, transfer from English to Russian should lead both heritage speakers and second language learners to be quite target-like. They shouldn't really face any difficulty in interpreting where the contrastive focus is in a sentence. On the other hand, if early age of acquisition due to exposure to oral input can be an advantage in this domain, we might once again expect that heritage speakers would have an advantage over second language learners. So the first half of our study, study 2A, actually tested contrastive focus as part of the same bimodal AJT that I discussed relative to study 1. And the participants were exactly the same as the ones whose data I already presented in study 1. So in this case, we're not looking at Hebrew, so we're only looking at the L1 English, L2 Russian learners and the English dominant heritage speakers. Again, exactly the same learners as in study 1. Here is a sample token set from the bimodal AJT, which tested contrastive focus. We would have a question such as, are we going to the theater tomorrow? Мы завтра идем в театр. And depending on the condition, that question was answered in 4 different ways. Condition A had canonical word order and prosodic prominence on the focused element. Нет, мы идем на концерт. No, we're going to the concert, where concert contrast with theater. Condition B had the same prosodic prominence on concert, but non-canonical word order. Нет, мы на концерт идем. While conditions C and D were infelicitous because the element that received prosodic prominence was not the one being focused, right? So the question is, are we going to the theater? And the answer is no, we are going to the concert, which is prosodically infelicitous because it's not the subject, the we, that's being contrasted, but rather the location where we're going. And same thing in D, where the condition D, the verb were contrastive, was prosodically prominent, even though it wasn't the one in contrastive focus. So crucially, we have 2 felicitous conditions and 2 infelicitous conditions. The only difference between the 2 felicitous conditions is that one had canonical word order and the other didn't. And we had 24 target items, 6 per condition. So here are the study results. Again, comparing 3 groups, monolingual, heritage, and L2 speakers of Russian. So if we start with the baseline monolingual speakers, the pink orange bars, as expected, they rated the 2 felicitous conditions, A and B, quite high, and the 2 infelicitous ones, C and D, quite low. The heritage speakers in green exhibited exactly the same patterns, while the second language learners in blue had much less in the way of a difference between conditions. They rated condition A the highest, that was again canonical or felicitous canonical word order, but the other 3 conditions pattern very similar. But once again, recall that our heritage speakers were significantly more proficient in Russian than our second language learners. And this time, once we included proficiency into the analysis, it actually fully accounted for the results. In this case, both the heritage speakers and the second language learners showed the same kind of improvement with proficiency. Both improved on studied rating the felicitous conditions higher and the infelicitous conditions lower as they became more proficient in Russian. So in this case, even though at the group level, the heritage speakers look like they have an advantage over the second language learners, that advantage seems to be fully a function of proficiency test scores. So to summarize, while the heritage speakers did exhibit an advantage to learners in this domain, in particular, they were much more similar to our baseline monolinguals. The L2 learners made much smaller distinctions. In particular, they tended to over-accept the infelicitous conditions. But again, this difference was largely due to the heritage speakers being more proficient than the L2 learners. While proficiency was taking into account, the difference between second language and heritage speakers was no longer significant, and both groups showed the same pattern of improvement with proficiency. So in this case, there seems to be no particular advantage conferred by early age of acquisition, only an advantage conferred by proficiency. So now we want to come back and compare our two studies. So in our first set of studies, where we found that heritage speakers when it came to non-canonical word order, study 1A, we found that heritage speakers had an advantage over second language learners. Specifically, heritage speakers, but not second language learners, recognize that Russian allows OVS, and in fact prefers OVS order for subject questions. And crucially, this advantage was not accounted for by proficiency. In contrast, in study 2A, while the heritage speakers did have an advantage over second language learners in mapping contrastive focus to prosodic prominence, this effect disappeared once proficiency was taken into account. And remember that both studies were part of the same overall test instrument administered to exactly the same group of participants. So why do we find this difference? Why do heritage speakers have an advantage over L2 learners on word order, but not on contrastive focus? We think that this is where cross-linguistic influence plays a role. After all, English marks contrastive focus quite similarly to Russian, using prosodic prominence, but English does not have OVS order. So it seems that at least with increased proficiency, second language learners can become quite successful and can do well on mapping contrastive focus to prosodic prominence, because this is something that happens in English as well as in Russian. On the other hand, when it comes to something brand new, figuring out the discourse function of a non-canonical word order, here heritage speakers succeed, but second language learners do. So it seems that the cross-linguistic influence helps second language learners, but heritage speakers do well even for phenomena where the cross-linguistic influence doesn't help. Next, we want to turn to why, given that overall, when it came to contrastive focus, second language learners at high proficiency did quite well, but we wondered why at low proficiency they didn't do so well. After all, if we look at second language learners as a group, and especially second language learners at low proficiency, they tended to accept all of our conditions, including the ones where contrastive focus clearly clashed with prosodic prominence. So we wondered what led to this particular problem. Was the issue that the learners did not perceive the prosodic prominence, or did they not recognize which element was in contrastive focus? It was, after all, quite a demanding task. In this bimodal HAT, they had to attend to the prosody of the sentences, attend to the dialogue, and determine the acceptability of the answer to the question by attending both to the discourse context and to the prosody of the sentence. So the goal of our follow-up study, which I call here study 2B, and that has been spearheaded by my co-author, Tatiana Luchkina, she's the primary author on this part of the study. The goal here was to independently assess second language learners' ability to detect discourse prominence versus prosodic prominence. So how do we do this? Well, first, this is a follow-up study. So we have a new set of participants, 35 baseline monolingual speakers. And so far, the testing is ongoing, but so far we have 26 second language learners of Russian. 3 of them look from their profiles like they might be heritage speakers, so we may need to exclude them from analysis later on. The proficiency range is very similar to what we had in study 1. The learners were largely drawn from the same kind of population. In the study, the participants had to complete 2 separate tasks. Both of them involved prominence detection. In the silent reading task, they had to detect which element is prominent in the discourse, while in the listening task, they had to identify which element is prosodically prominent. We used the materials from our original study in this follow-up. So in fact, we took the original audio files, so that rather than re-record them, and ran the same, had our participants in the follow-up study judge, in the case of the listening task, judge these exact same audio files. So where crucially prosodic prominence was either felicitous or not. So we did also use our items from study 1, SEO versus OVS. We did also test those in the follow-up study, but I won't be talking about them today. So in the silent reading task, this is what it looked like. First, the participants would only listen, not read, but only listen to our questions, such as, are we going to the theater tomorrow? Then they would view the answer in written form. So in this case, because once we take away the prosodic cues, our 4 conditions actually only come down to 2, canonical versus non-canonical word order. We are going to the concert versus we are going to the concert. No prosodic cues, no prosodic prominence. And the task of the participants was click on the word which should be the most prominent for the dialogue to sound natural. And only content words were clickable, right? So in this case, the felicitous thing to do would be to click on concert as opposed to we or go. Again, no prosodic cues. Not surprisingly, both of our groups were extremely accurate on the silent reading task. So the monolinguals are in blue, the L2 learners are in orange. Both groups are pretty much at ceiling or very close to ceiling in terms of accuracy, where of course accuracy meant clicking on the element which was contrastively focused in the question, that is concert in this case. Summarizing our analysis, we did find L2 learners to be significantly less accurate than monolinguals, even though numerically that was a very small difference. But that difference held largely held across conditions. With increased proficiency, L2 learners even improved in accuracy across conditions even further. So we conclude that L2 learners do not have a problem detecting which element is in contrastive focus. They're clearly able to use the discourse to establish what is prominent. But of course, this task did not involve prosodic manipulations. In the listening task, participants would listen to the entire dialogue. First, the question, are we going to the theater? And then one of the 4 answer options. And they would be presented with only the answer in written form. And in this case, they were told that they had to click on the word in the answer which was the most prominent. We had training items to explain, to train them on what we meant by prosodic prominence. So basically, they were instructed to listen to the word which was louder, longer, more extreme in pitch, more crisply articulated. So they were specifically instructed and trained on paying attention to the prosody. So that's why we call this a prosodic prominence test. So in this case, the target word to click on would be concert in conditions A and B, the subject we in condition C, and the verb going in condition D. Of course, crucially, in the case of conditions C and D, the prosodically prominent word clashes with the context established by the question. And here are the results. What we found here is that both monolinguals and second language learners were more accurate in the felicitous than the infelicitous conditions. But while the monolinguals were still pretty accurate even in the infelicitous conditions, so they were able to indicate that, it's the verb that's prosodically prominent, even though that's not the word that's contrastively focused, the second language learners were significantly less accurate in those conditions. So to summarize, the second language learners were significantly less accurate monolinguals in the infelicitous conditions, with much less of a difference in the felicitous conditions. And the inaccurate response nearly always involved identifying the word which was in contrastive focus. So basically going for the word which is discourse prominent rather than the one that's prosodically prominent. In condition B, felicitous with non-canonical word order with 2 groups were equally accurate. And interestingly, in condition A, with canonical word order, the learners did even better than the monolinguals. The learners did improve with proficiency in the 2 infelicitous conditions. So what does it mean? Well, it seems that at low proficiency levels, the second language learners largely ignored the prosodic cues and opted for even though they were instructed to pay attention to prosodic prominence, they nevertheless went for discourse prominence. Why did they ignore prosodic prominence? Well, the issue with this listening task, as well as with the original bimodal AJT, is that, of course, discourse prominence was pitted against prosodic prominence. So we were asking participants to go in the listening task to identify the prosody while essentially ignoring the context. This is, of course, pretty unnatural. In natural speech, we expect that discourse prominence and prosodic prominence go hand in hand. So there is some evidence that even native speakers sometimes over-rely on discourse prominence and disregard prosodic cues. So given the demanding nature of our tasks, it's not particularly surprising that second language learners at lower levels of proficiency might over-rely on top-down effects and just go for discourse prominence, disregarding prosodic prominence. But crucially, as they become more proficient and better able to handle the task, they are able to do this and to correctly map discourse to prosodic prominence. So what are the implications of this follow-up study to our original findings? Well, we find that learners are just as good as monolinguals at determining the location of prosodic contrastive focus, but are less accurate at detecting the location of prosodic prominence when it clashes with the location of discourse prominence. So it seems that to the extent that we found non-target performance at among low proficiency learners in the original task, most likely this was due to their ignoring prosodic prominence due to task demands and not to actual difficulty with contrastive focus per se. So I'm almost done. To go back to our original research questions about comparisons between heritage speakers and second language learners, what have we learned? Well, first, do heritage speakers have a selective advantage over second language learners at the syntax discourse interface? For the relationship between word order and information structure, the answer is quite clearly yes. This looked to be where proficiency did not account for the heritage L2 differences, where early age of acquisition really confirmed an advantage. But for the expression of contrastive focus, no, any advantage was just a function of proficiency. So overall, it looks like heritage speakers do have a selective advantage specifically on the mapping between word order and information structure in Russian. Is there transfer from the dominant language in this domain? Well, maybe. Here, it's not so clear. There is some evidence for transfer. First of all, the fact that our participants performed much better with SVO than with OVS orders. That's certainly consistent with transfer from English. And the performance of second language learners, the fact that they did much better in contrastive focus than with word order, certainly suggests the facilitative influence of English. On the other hand, when it came to a comparison between our two heritage speakers groups, Hebrew versus English did not make a difference. So either there is no cross-linguistic influence for heritage speakers in this domain, or as I mentioned earlier, Hebrew is just not the right target language. So the question of cross-linguistic influence with heritage speakers still remains open. And finally, do both heritage speakers and second language learners improve with proficiency? The answer depends on the group. For heritage speakers, they improved with proficiency on both phenomena tested, both non-canonical word order and contrastive focus. But for second language learners, the improvement was only with contrastive focus. They didn't improve on non-canonical word order. Overall, if we look specifically at the heritage speakers' performance in our studies, we found that heritage speakers do quite well with Russian information structure. The fact that they perform quite close to baseline monolinguals and near ceilings in both of our studies is not consistent with the interface hypothesis, which predicts vulnerability for syntax discourse phenomena for all types of bilinguals. A caveat, though, is that in its more recent instantiations, the interface hypothesis is argued to be primarily about processing pressure, but we didn't place our participants under any particular processing pressure in the sense that this wasn't a timed study. They could take their time to answer the questions. On a recent proposal by Polinsky and Contrast about heritage language development, they argue that those studies that find heritage speakers diverging from baseline monolinguals can largely be grouped under 4 categories, that the phenomena tested involve resisting ambiguity. So what heritage speakers are doing for the phenomena tested is resisting ambiguity, regularizing irregulars, and shrinking the structure. The information structure phenomena don't fall under any of these areas. So it's consistent with their proposal that we find the relationship between word order and information structure to be quite robust in heritage speakers. To conclude, we find that phenomena at the syntax discourse interface is relatively unimpaired in adult heritage speakers and doesn't appear to be subject to transfer from the dominant language of heritage speakers. While in contrast, second language learners have difficulty with interface phenomena that have no L1 equivalent. So early age of acquisition does seem to confer a selective advantage. Possible directions for future study include potentially running the study with time pressure to see if then heritage speakers do pattern more with second language learners. directly comparing heritage speakers and second language learners at multiple phenomena, internal interface as well as external interface phenomena within the same study. And this third thing is something we're planning to do probably in the near future, using a different task to examine L2 learners' sensitivity of prosodic prominence by taking away the context to see if learners would successfully detect prosodic prominence once there are no contextual cues related to discourse. Okay, thank you very much.
We have some time for questions.
Yes?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry,
I had a couple of questions, but maybe I will start with the naive one with respect to the perception that second language learners tend to get the prosody of the language they're learning quite well, their phonology in general. That's one of the last things they tend to get right or sound native, sort of impressionistic. And I'm assuming that's not true so much of the heritage speakers. And I was wondering whether you had thought of, or you can think of ways in which to do some of the contrastive focus studies from a production point of view, to see whether, even though of course they improve with, the English speakers are improving with competence, it may be that they never quite get there in terms of production. So they might know that there's an outline in tune for contrastive focus, but they actually may never quite get the target. And I think that's interesting in its own right, and may point to the different ways in which prosody is being used as a cue as a second language learner, because it's known that, of course, little children are extremely malleable and sensitive to prosody, and that's something that the L2ers aren't getting. So yeah, I was wondering whether you had any plans to do it on production.
Not at the moment. That would, I mean, that's definitely, I absolutely agree. That's something that would be very interesting to especially to look at production and perception within the same study. I think that's something, you know, my co-author is Tatiana Luchkina. She's a phonologist, so she's kind of the one who deals with the prosody side of this project. So I think that's something that would be kind of up to her if she wants to take this on and actually do a production study. I mean, there's just the logistics basically are always the challenge. But I think nowadays, as you know, Jennifer was saying earlier, right, it's so much more acceptable to do all data collection online because we don't, you know, we don't have heritage speakers or second language learners available. We don't have that many available to us locally. So this was remote testing study even before COVID. And I think that's one reason why we went for comprehension perception, because that's very straightforward to do online. Production less so, but I think nowadays people are much more used to also, you know, recording themselves for production purposes. So that's something logistically maybe easier. So yes, absolutely. In the case of Spanish, I know Tania Ionin, Bradley Hood, and others. They have done production of focus in Spanish. They've done separate studies with both second language and heritage speakers, and they found, if I remember correctly, that for the most part the participants did quite well. That they did put the prosodic prominence in the right place for most conditions. That's if I remember their results correctly. So we know that, of course, when it comes to just phonology per se, heritage speakers tend to sound much more native-like than second language learners. But I don't know if that necessarily means that the second language learners can't get the right place for prosodic prominence. So my guess could be that yeah, they might not produce the right contour. I agree, right? On the actual fine-grained phonological phonetic analysis, they would probably not sound native-like, but presumably they would at least get the right word out. So I agree, that would be very interesting to do. Something I'll definitely talk to Tatiana about. Thank you.
I had a question about the effect from the first study about L2 speakers not getting the subject. Why would one even expect them to get it? Because they probably have very limited input, and it's probably not something that is explicitly taught in their courses, right?
Yeah, so I guess it's not particularly surprising that they never do figure out OVS. In a sense, I found it quite surprising that the heritage speakers were so good, because heritage speakers' input is also quite limited, right? And oral input does not even contain that many instances of non-canonical word order. And of course, if they do take Russian in the classroom, then it's exactly as with second language learners. there are cues from English that could be helpful, right? The basic put old information before new information that's not specific to Russian, right? It could be some kind of a universal, principle that should be accessible to both populations equally. So one might think that with high proficiency, as they've gotten more input in Russian and recognize that, oh, Russian has fairly free word order, case marking tells us what's the subject or the object. So now, it might follow from universal principles that if word order is flexible and you can do OBS as well as SVO, why would you do it? Well, that the object would be new information, the subject would be old information, right? But that doesn't seem to happen for second language learners. They're very much, at least, up through the proficiency levels that we've tested. I'm sure it could be possible for extremely, advanced and immersed learners, but not for our classroom learners. So it does look in this case that perhaps input is relevant, facilitative. Yeah. I don't know.
I again did not see who exactly was first, but let's start from here.
Mine was going to be a follow-up to the input. So if it is not in the input, if it is not taught at school, how come they are so good? I mean, I'm glad to hear that they are. I love that they are. But then what is it? Like, do we know more about the nature of the input? Is it the TV that they watch? Is it the music?
Yeah.
What is it?
So in terms of the heritage speaker advantage over L2 learners, I think there are two possible answers. One would be that it is, after all, a function of input. After all, we don't have access to information about the exact input they're getting. So even though OBS is infrequent in the input, it is still there, and presumably the heritage speakers are getting more input than the L2 learners, just because they have a chance to interact with Russian. It's not something that's limited to the classroom. They interact with, with their families. Maybe they watch TV. So even though it's very little input, it's enough to give them this knowledge. The other possibility, of course, is that it's more about universal learning, right? That this basic idea that old comes before new is a universal property of language. And as long as you're exposed to the language when you're very, very young, you get it, right? So in a sense, one could say the very fact that Russian has case marking and flexible word order, these 3-year-olds, maybe they haven't had that much input with OBS order, but even if it's only 5% of their input, it's enough to trigger this idea, oh, OBS order is possible. And if it's possible, therefore, it should be used, when the object is old information and the subject is new information. I think to really tease apart how much here is universal and how much is the property of the input, we'd have to have, very detailed input study, compare heritage speakers under different input circumstances. So I don't.
Very similar question. So, Tania's question, I was wondering on the other side for the L2 learners, you mentioned that it wasn't part of what's explicitly taught in L2 Russian instruction. So I was wondering, is it that they can't, or is it that it's just not taught? Because if you gave even lower proficiency learners, like early on, I don't know why you would, but if you told them about this discourse in Russian, like would they be able to just overcome that fact that it's not in English, or do you feel that because you've tested such high proficiency levels and they still haven't picked up on it, that it's been much more difficult for them to process that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are many different ways to answer it. So first of all, is this something that sufficiently advanced Russian speakers could get on their own? Right. For example, if we went, we did advance, in terms of our proficiency test, we did get some high proficiency learners, but they were still all instructed classroom learners, right? If we went to learners in an immersed setting with a lot of study abroad, would they recognize it? So if certainly they do, that would kind of go back to the previous point, right? That it would suggest that it's not just about early age of acquisition. It is possible to get this very complex, relationship if you just kind of cross that input threshold. So maybe it was really about these learners just not getting enough input in Russian. The other part of your question was, is this something that can be explicitly instructed? So the only explicit instruction study I'm aware of on Russian word order was the one I mentioned earlier by Van Patten and colleagues, but they were entirely focused on using case marking to determine who did what to who, right? So it had nothing to do with information structure. It was just about, dog bit cat, who did the biting versus cat bit dog, right? And there, they use processing instruction to attract learners' attention to case marking and to the existence of OBS order, and the learners did succeed. It was I would imagine that one could probably use a similar technique to, get learners used to. It's not just that OBS order is possible anywhere, but it's only possible in answer to subject question. The $1 million question in instructed SLA, of course, can these kind of intervention effects hold over time? Yes, they succeed, right after they do the study, maybe they still succeeded a week later, but do they still know this stuff a year later? And very, very few intervention studies follow learners for more than a couple of weeks. So I think we still don't know enough about how well these effects hold over time, but that would be extremely interesting to do.
The question is, like, do they need to use it? Because if it's worked for them and they're high proficiency and they're perfectly capable of speaking Russian, then
exactly, you can get away with using SVO all the time. You might sound unnatural in places, but people will understand you, right? So that's it's not really a barrier to communication. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah, first a comment question. So first, like 5% is quite a lot still, right? That's 100% sentences every day, right?
Yeah.
But I'm more curious about the effect of proficiency for heritage speakers and how you interpret that. And first, do you know, like, when the Russian kids learn this? And then your effect of proficiency C, do you think that's a sign of incomplete acquisition or attrition? Or is it just testing? I would ask you to actually learn it very late so that you basically unlearn it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm aware of one. I don't know of any studies with bilingual kids. Let's see. Yes, so studies with monolingual Russian kids do suggest that they get this extremely early. I think Dina Brun, Sergei Abrutin, they had a couple of studies with 2-year-olds in Russian, and suddenly they are already using. Even though kids do tend to over-rely on canonical word order, but they were already using a variety of word orders. And so I think in the Brun and Abrutin study, if I remember correctly, they classified the subjects and objects based on definiteness, indefiniteness, but really that, given that Russian is an articulous language, that very closely corresponded to old versus new information. And the kids did tend to put the so-called definite or old information earlier in the sentence than the indefinite. So yes, for monolingual kids at least, this seems to be in place extremely early. So I've also wondered about, what exactly are we getting at when we're measuring heritage speakers' proficiency, right? And it's exactly as you say. It could be that all of our heritage speakers, having been exposed to Russian early in life, got this, but the heritage speakers that we are now classifying as less proficient are the ones who lost a lot of their Russian because they stopped using it at home, largely, and became dominant in English. Alternatively, some of our low proficiency heritage speakers maybe never became fully fluent in Russian and maybe never got this in the first place, right? So without either a longitudinal investigation or like really, really detailed information about their background, lives, and input, I don't think we can definitively answer this question. But I would guess that it's some combination of the two, right? That the heritage speakers who are low proficiency and who don't get this relationship either never learned it in the first place, just because they had very limited Russian input and maybe never really used Russian that much, or alternatively, they got it but then lost it due to misuse. I think these are both. I don't think at this point we can definitively tease those two apart. Yeah. I think Yulia was next. Oh, okay, sorry.
Sorry, I want to follow up on this, on the first study, because I wanted to also talk about the word order, which is kind of, it's really interesting, but also connecting it to the thing you found later on, where second language learners were sort of underhearing prosody and going for top-down and semantic information. And I think it points to an interesting interaction between processing and input, in the sense that if it is true that learners who are not proficient or who are maybe not well versed in certain kinds of cues, especially prosodic cues, I'm assuming maybe OBS also has a kind of tune. If they're not well versed in picking up those bottom-up cues, it may be that the second language learners are actually underhearing OBS, and so that is going to affect their input in some way. So that they actually go for top-down semantics and hear it as their dominant SVO because they are so in other words, I guess I'm going back to a very early role for prosody, where becoming automatized with certain prosodic cues can actually bootstrap you into using bottom-up information in a better, more efficient way. And you can maybe make better use of your OBS input than the second language learners who maybe overhear it as what they expect to hear.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So of course, the cues for SVO versus OBS are not prosodic, right? The case endings are the cues. So what you're saying essentially is that when second language learners hear Lisu visitorial, Fox accusative sees eagle nominative, that they actually think that this means the fox saw the eagle.
No, I think that they internalize it as they remember it, they hear it. They don't remember it as that they heard OBS. They remember the content because of the
well, so we didn't,
form.
so first of all, so in our task, we didn't place any memory burden on them. They had the dialogues up there on the screen to read as well, and then they were also listening to them. So all the information was available to them. They didn't have to keep it in memory. And actually what we found is that our second language learners rated OVS significantly lower than SVO, which to me suggests that they were not thinking that they were not just encoding OVS as SVO. They recognized it as non-canonical, but they didn't consider it to be very acceptable. They would have preferred the canonical. Oh, okay, but you mean in general?
When they are surrounded by Russian, you know, you recognize and you clock and you, so in terms of the frequency,
Right.
If they're not clocking, they're not.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, no, I think what studies like, for example, the Van Patten et al. Intervention study suggest is that learners, at least second language classroom learners at low proficiency, don't even recognize, they ignore the case endings basically. So when exposed to something like fox saw eagle, they actually think that it means the fox saw the eagle. So they over rely on the first noun as the subject, second is the object, and that's that. So yes, you're absolutely right that not only is the OVS input limited, but they're not even making use of it when it's there if they're ignoring the case endings, which is precisely that was precisely our concern was, you know, can we really test their understanding of what OVS means if they're ignoring the case endings? So that's why, in addition to the regular proficiency test, we also had a case check test. I didn't present it here, but it was a very simple test, like, you know, fox saw eagle. Well, it was different. It was the same nouns, but it was different sentences, right? So, you know, squirrel saw horse. Who did the seeing? And the right answer depended on, you know, which noun was nominative versus accusative. You know, so we had a range of scores. Some participants, of course, just treated everything as, assumed that everything was SVO. Others did pay attention to the case endings. But we included their performance on the task into our proficiency score. And still, we didn't see improvement. So even learners who improve in proficiency and who are pretty good at recognizing which is the subject, which is the object, still don't recognize the information structure. That's an extra layer that they haven't gotten yet. Yeah, absolutely.
I must say your participants were quite proficient because your proficiency task is also very complex, actually, the way I view it, and I discussed it with my colleagues who teach Russian as a second language. They said that it's a very advanced proficiency test.
Are you talking about the closed test? So this was the multiple choice version of the closed test. So Tatiana is the lead author on that one. Yeah, so she developed originally a fill in the blank closed test first, get a traditional closed test. But when she validated it, what she found was very much a bimodal distribution. A lot of second language learners just couldn't do it. They barely filled any of the blanks incorrectly, while they, you know, then you had advanced learners or heritage speakers who did really well. So then she created a multiple choice version of the test, and that one came out much better. It was actually able, so it's still a closed test, but for every blank, there are 3 options. So it's much less burden on the participants because it's recognition, not production. And that one is actually able to capture quite a pattern of proficiency levels rather than just going for high versus low. It's also easy for learners to do. So that's why we're relying on that one in the study.
To ask and to suggest, because I very much like the design and your idea maybe to test a different heritage language group. So your participants were quite exceeded or almost exceeded the heritage language. But then we mentioned Finnish, Finnish language, which marks word order prosodically, just like Russian, or is it a different?
I don't know about the prosody, but I just know that it has very productive case morphology, and OVS is very frequent. So it's something.
I would predict that those who mark those languages that mark word order prosodically, the speakers of those languages would have an advantage, especially maybe even second language to take not English, but you know, I mean, some other Slavic language maybe.
Well, the issue is with going from Russian to another, or from another Slavic language to Russian is too much, you know, typological similarities. So that's why I was thinking of Finnish, because, you know, it's still an extremely different language, but it's only the, yeah, definitely. Thanks.